Hello, Leo. Wow, this energy feels powerful right away. Someone here is realizing that your silence affected them far more than they ever expected. For a long time, they may have assumed you would always be there, always understanding, always patient, always willing to keep the connection alive. But something changed. You stopped explaining. You stopped chasing. You stopped carrying the weight of everything on your own. And now they're being forced to sit with the space you left behind. And I have to be honest, this person doesn't seem comfortable with that at all. They're thinking about conversations they never finished, things they never said, moments they brushed aside because they believed there would always be another chance. But why is your absence speaking louder than your presence ever did? Why are they suddenly noticing your value now that your energy is no longer constantly available to them? This person may be realizing that what they took for granted was actually one of the most genuine connections in their life. And what's interesting is that the more you focus on yourself, the more they seem unable to stop thinking about you. Okay, let's see what the cards want to reveal about what's really happening behind the scenes. The first card that immediately catches my attention is the Four of Swords. And I have to be honest, Leo, this doesn't feel like ordinary silence. This feels like the kind of silence that forces someone to hear their own thoughts. Because I'm looking at the Four of Swords, and what keeps coming through is someone who thought they had more time. More time to figure things out. More time to say what they wanted to say. More time to decide how they truly felt. But now they're sitting alone with memories that won't leave them alone. You know, sometimes people don't realize how much space you occupy in their life until that space suddenly becomes empty. And that's exactly what this energy feels like. I'm noticing the Page of Swords showing up here as well. Wow. This person feels curious about you in a way they may not even fully understand. It's almost like they're paying attention to things they used to overlook. Little details, little habits, the way you used to show up, the way you used to care, the way you somehow brought warmth into situations without demanding anything in return. The interesting thing is that none of those moments seemed extraordinary at the time. They became important later. They became important once they were gone. And that's what I'm feeling here. This person became so accustomed to your presence that they stopped noticing how much comfort it provided. Not because they didn't care, not because they intentionally wanted to hurt you, but because familiarity can sometimes create blindness. When someone believes a connection will always be there, they stop paying attention to how valuable it really is. Now I'm seeing the Five of Cups, and this card feels emotional, not dramatic, not chaotic, just deeply reflective. This feels like someone replaying moments in their mind. Conversations, choices, missed opportunities, things they could have handled differently, things they wish they had taken more seriously. I keep getting this image of somebody remembering the smallest things, not the big events, not the major milestones, the ordinary moments, the simple messages, the check-ins, the kindness, the effort. Because sometimes those are the very things people fail to appreciate until they're no longer receiving them. And Leo, what stands out to me is that your silence feels different now. This doesn't feel like a game. It doesn't feel like you're trying to prove a point. It feels like your energy has shifted. You've stopped carrying the connection by yourself. You've stopped trying to convince someone to see your worth. You've stopped explaining things that should have been obvious, and whether this person expected it or not, they're feeling that change. The more I sit with these cards, the more I feel this growing awareness inside of them. Because now the Hermit is appearing, and the Hermit feels very quiet, very private, very personal. This is somebody spending more time alone with their thoughts than they let other people know. Some of you may not even realize how much reflection is happening behind the scenes, because this person may appear completely normal on the outside. They may continue their routines, go to work, talk to friends, handle responsibilities, but internally something feels different. Internally, they're questioning things. They're looking back. They're trying to understand why your absence feels so much heavier than they expected, why your silence keeps echoing inside their mind, why certain memories keep resurfacing, why they keep wondering what you're doing, how you're feeling, whether you've moved forward emotionally, whether you've already reached a place where you no longer need them the way you once did. And I have to be honest, that question alone feels significant because for the first time, this energy doesn't feel focused on what they want. It feels focused on what they may have lost. The Four of Swords, the Page of Swords, the Five of Cups, the Hermit. All of these cards together create the feeling of someone sitting quietly with truths they can no longer ignore. And the longer they sit with those truths, the harder it becomes to pretend that nothing has changed. I'm noticing something here. The energy shifts the moment I see the Judgment card. And this doesn't feel loud. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like realization. The kind that arrives when someone can no longer distract themselves from what they're feeling. Because what I'm sensing is that this person keeps revisiting certain moments with you, not because they're trying to, but because their mind keeps bringing them back there. A conversation, a message, a moment where you were trying to understand them, trying to support them, trying to stay connected. And at the time, they may not have fully seen it. They may have been focused on their own fears, their own distractions, their own unresolved emotions. But something feels different now. The judgment card feels like someone looking at the same memories through completely different eyes. And honestly, that can be uncomfortable. Because once you start seeing things clearly, it's difficult to go back to the story you used to tell yourself. Okay, the Six of Cups is appearing beside it. Wow, this feels incredibly personal. I'm getting the feeling that this person has been remembering small details that nobody else would understand. The way you laughed at certain things, the way you responded when they were having a difficult day, the way you made them feel seen without asking for recognition in return. It's interesting because these aren't memories of grand gestures. These are memories of consistency, of presence, of emotional safety. And I keep hearing the same thought repeating in their energy. I didn't realize how much they were giving. Not because Leo was trying to earn love, not because Leo was trying to prove anything, but because your care became familiar, and familiar things often become invisible until they're gone. Now the Nine of Swords comes into view, and I have to be honest. This feels like somebody losing sleep over thoughts they can't turn off. Not necessarily because they're expecting the worst, but because questions keep surfacing. Questions that don't have easy answers. What if they misunderstood you? What if they pushed you away without realizing it? What if they assumed you would always be there? What if the silence means something has truly changed? This person keeps circling around these thoughts, trying to find certainty, trying to find reassurance. But instead, they keep finding themselves back in the same place, thinking about you, thinking about what happened, thinking about everything they wish they understood sooner. And there is something vulnerable about that, because this energy doesn't feel defensive anymore. It feels reflective. It feels human. The moon is here now, and this is interesting, because I don't think this person fully understands the depth of what they're feeling yet. Part of them does. Part of them recognizes that something important is happening internally. But another part of them is still trying to sort through emotions that don't fit neatly into words. They're questioning themselves, questioning old decisions, questioning assumptions they once felt certain about. And what stands out to me is how much of this process is happening privately. This isn't somebody announcing their realizations to the world. This feels like somebody sitting alone, driving somewhere, lying awake at night, looking out a window, trying to understand why your energy keeps finding its way back into their thoughts. Why memories of you carry so much weight. Why your absence feels different from every other absence they've experienced. Because the more they reflect, the harder it becomes to reduce this connection to something casual. The harder it becomes to pretend that you didn't matter. And the harder it becomes to ignore the growing feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was far more value in what you offered than they allowed themselves to see at the time. This is interesting. The energy changes quite a bit the moment the tower appears. And I know when people hear the tower, they often expect something dramatic. But what I'm feeling here is much more personal than that. This feels like somebody reaching a point where certain parts of their life no longer make sense the way they used to. Maybe it's work. Maybe it's family expectations. Maybe it's financial pressure. Maybe it's responsibilities they've been carrying for years, without questioning whether they were still happy carrying them. Whatever it is, something feels like it's shifting underneath the surface. And I don't think they saw it coming. Because sometimes life keeps moving so fast that people don't realize how exhausted they've become until they finally stop and look around. And that's exactly where this energy feels like it is. The Ten of Wands is sitting right beside the tower. Wow! This person looks tired. Not physically tired, soul tired. The kind of tired that comes from trying to hold everything together for too long. Trying to solve every problem. Trying to meet everyone's expectations. Trying to be what everyone else needs them to be. And somewhere in the middle of all that pressure, they seem to have lost sight of themselves. I keep hearing the phrase, I can't keep doing things the same way. Not because they're giving up, not because they're weak, but because something inside them is beginning to recognize that survival and fulfillment are not the same thing. And I have to be honest, when people reach that realization, it changes them, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. The Justice card is coming through very strongly now. And what stands out to me is that this person seems to be evaluating their life differently than before. They're asking themselves difficult questions. Questions that don't have comfortable answers. Questions about priorities. Questions about choices. Questions about where their time and energy have actually gone. This doesn't feel like somebody pointing fingers anymore. It feels like somebody looking inward, because the more they reflect, the more they're beginning to notice patterns, certain decisions, certain fears, certain habits they've repeated for years. And suddenly those patterns don't feel invisible anymore. They're impossible to ignore. Okay, something else is standing out. There may be situations around this person that once felt stable but now feel uncertain. Career paths, family dynamics, friendships, long-standing obligations, things they accepted without question before, things they thought would always remain the same. And yet something is causing them to see those situations through a different lens, almost like they're waking up to aspects of their own life they weren't fully paying attention to. The Death card appears here, and honestly, this feels less like an ending and more like an awakening. Not an awakening about you specifically, an awakening about themselves. Because I'm noticing somebody who is becoming increasingly aware that growth often asks for sacrifice. Sometimes people outgrow old versions of themselves. Sometimes they outgrow environments. Sometimes they outgrow beliefs they once built their entire identity around. And that process can feel incredibly uncomfortable, especially when it forces someone to admit that change is necessary. What fascinates me about this energy is that Leo seems connected to this realization in a way this person may not have expected. Because your silence created space. Space they couldn't fill with distractions. Space they couldn't avoid. Space where certain truths finally had room to surface. And while they're navigating these shifts, I don't think everything feels clear yet. There are still questions, still uncertainties, still pieces of the puzzle that haven't fully come together. But I do feel somebody beginning to understand that the version of themselves they've been holding on to for so long may not be the version that's meant to move forward. And as that awareness continues to grow, the choices in front of them begin to look very different than they once did. Wow. The energy softens here, but it also becomes impossible to ignore. Because the moment the Strength card appears, I get the feeling that something about you has genuinely changed in this person's eyes. Not because you've become someone else, not because you've transformed overnight, but because you're no longer standing in the same place emotionally. And I think that's what surprises them. You know, sometimes people expect us to remain exactly where they left us, to keep feeling the same way, to keep waiting, to keep holding space indefinitely. But that's not what I'm seeing here. What I'm seeing is growth, quiet growth. The kind that happens when nobody is watching. The kind that happens after disappointment, after reflection, after choosing yourself over and over again. And there is something about that energy that this person cannot stop noticing. Okay, the sun is showing up now. And I have to be honest, this card feels beautiful in this reading. Because while this person seems to have spent a lot of time looking inward, they're also becoming aware of how different your energy feels. You seem lighter, more present, more connected to yourself. Not because everything is perfect, not because life suddenly became easy, but because you've stopped making your happiness dependent on someone else's choices. And that realization feels powerful. I keep sensing this person looking at you and feeling slightly confused, not in a negative way. More like they're trying to understand when this shift happened. When did Leo become so comfortable standing in their own energy? When did Leo stop chasing validation? When did Leo become someone who seems completely capable of moving forward regardless of what anyone else decides to do? Because that's what catches their attention. Not words, not appearances, not social media. It's your energy. It's the feeling that you've become grounded in yourself. And honestly, that can be incredibly attractive. The Queen of Wands appears beside the Sun. And wow, there is a confidence here that feels natural. Not forced, not performative, not something you're trying to prove. This feels like somebody who has stopped shrinking themselves. Somebody who is no longer asking for permission to take up space. And I think this person notices that more than you realize. Because every time they think about you, they don't just remember who you were. They also notice who you're becoming. That contrast keeps standing out. The version of Leo they once knew. The version of Leo they're sensing now. And somewhere in between those two images, they're beginning to realize how much growth has taken place. I'm noticing something here. Part of what draws their attention isn't simply that you've changed. It's that you've changed without bitterness, without needing revenge, without needing to prove a point. You simply continued living your life, continued growing, continued becoming more comfortable with yourself. And that seems to challenge something inside of them, because they expected your silence. What they didn't expect was your peace. They expected distance. What they didn't expect was your confidence. They expected time to weaken your energy. Instead, Your energy seems stronger than before. The Nine of Pentacles is coming through now. And there is something very independent about this card in this reading. This person seems to be recognizing that you're building something meaningful for yourself, your own stability, your own goals, your own sense of fulfillment. And whether they're seeing this directly or simply feeling it energetically, it keeps pulling their attention back toward you. Because the more they observe, the more they realize that your life isn't standing still. It's moving, growing, expanding, and I have to be honest, that realization creates a different kind of urgency, not panic, not fear, just awareness. The awareness that people don't remain exactly the same forever. The awareness that opportunities evolve. The awareness that while they were busy navigating their own lessons, Leo continued becoming someone even more remarkable than they remembered. And the more that awareness settles in, the more difficult it becomes for them to simply watch from a distance and pretend they aren't affected by what they're seeing. Okay, something feels different here. The energy becomes much more active the moment the King of Wands appears. And I have to be honest, this doesn't feel like somebody who wants to stay hidden forever. For a while, they may have been comfortable watching from a distance, observing, thinking, questioning, trying to understand their own emotions before doing anything about them. But that energy feels increasingly difficult for them to maintain, because the more they think about you, the more they seem to realize that thoughts alone are no longer enough. This person wants information, not information from other people, not assumptions, not guesses. They want to know how you actually feel. They want to know where they stand. And what fascinates me is that they don't seem completely sure what they will find. That's part of what's making them hesitate, because there is a difference between imagining a conversation and actually having one. The King of Wands feels confident on the outside, but underneath that confidence, I see somebody preparing themselves for uncertainty. Somebody wondering if the door is still open. Somebody wondering if Leo still sees them the same way. Somebody wondering if too much time has passed. Wow! The Page of Cups is showing up beside it, and this energy feels surprisingly vulnerable, much softer than what we've been seeing. Because for all the confidence they try to project, there is still a part of them that feels nervous. I keep getting the image of someone typing a message and staring at it, reading it again, changing a few words, deleting it, starting over. Not because they don't know what they want to say, but because they care more than they want to admit. Because once words leave their mouth, everything becomes real. And there is something very real about this energy. This doesn't feel casual. This doesn't feel like somebody reaching out simply because they're bored or lonely. This feels like somebody who understands that a conversation could matter, that what happens next could feel important. I'm noticing something here. The Eight of Wands arrives almost like a sudden rush of momentum. And it's interesting because this card doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like movement, the kind of movement that starts internally long before anyone else sees it externally, a decision beginning to form, a hesitation beginning to weaken, a growing desire to stop wondering and start understanding. Because I think one of the hardest things for this person right now is not knowing how much has changed, not knowing whether your feelings shifted, not knowing whether the connection still exists in the way they remember it. The mind can create 1,000 different scenarios when certainty is absent. And I feel like this person has spent a lot of time living inside those scenarios, playing out conversations, imagining outcomes, thinking about possibilities. But eventually there comes a moment when imagination stops being enough. And that feels very close to this energy. The Knight of Cups is the card that catches my attention next. And this is interesting, because what I notice here isn't urgency. It's sincerity. There is something about this person that seems tired of pretending they don't care, tired of acting unaffected, tired of carrying feelings privately. Even if they haven't figured everything out yet, there is a growing awareness that avoiding emotions doesn't make them disappear. If anything, it seems to make them stronger. And Leo, what stands out most is that this person appears to be weighing something very carefully. Not whether you matter, that part feels obvious. Not whether they're affected, that part feels obvious too. The question they're wrestling with is whether they are ready to be honest enough to let you see what has been happening inside them. Because honesty requires courage, especially when the outcome cannot be controlled, especially when the other person has changed, especially when that other person is standing in their power. And the more this person sits with that reality, the more they seem to understand that some risks cannot be avoided forever. This is interesting. The energy becomes very quiet here. Not because this person has stopped feeling. Quite the opposite, because they're finally confronting something they've been trying not to think about. And the moment I see the lovers, I immediately get the sense that this connection has become impossible for them to dismiss. Not because someone forced them to acknowledge it, not because circumstances pushed them into it, but because their feelings keep finding their way back to the same place, back to the same person, back to the same questions, back to you. And what stands out is that this no longer feels theoretical. This isn't somebody wondering whether the connection mattered. This feels like somebody wondering whether they still have time. Because there is a difference, a very big difference. The Two of Wands appears beside the lovers, and wow, I keep getting the feeling that this person is standing at a crossroads internally, looking toward one path, looking toward another, realizing that staying exactly where they are may no longer be an option because life keeps moving, people keep growing, circumstances keep changing, and I think that realization has become increasingly difficult for them to ignore. You know, there are moments in life when we assume opportunities will wait for us, that certain people will always be there, that certain conversations can happen later, that certain feelings can be addressed another day. But eventually, later starts feeling uncertain. And that's what I see happening here. This person seems to be recognizing that time has its own momentum. And while they were trying to figure everything out, Leo continued living, continued growing, continued becoming. I have to be honest, I don't think rejection is their greatest fear. What feels much stronger than rejection is the possibility that you've genuinely moved forward. The possibility that your heart no longer occupies the same space it once did. The possibility that the version of Leo who waited patiently no longer exists. Because if that is true, then certain choices suddenly carry much more weight. The Ten of Pentacles is coming through now. And what catches my attention is the way this person seems to be viewing the future differently. Not necessarily because they have every answer. Not necessarily because they figured everything out. But because they're beginning to understand the value of what was standing in front of them. This feels like somebody reflecting on what truly matters, what creates meaning, what creates stability, what creates a sense of home. And as those thoughts become more important, other things seem less important than they once were. Old distractions, old excuses, old fears, things that once felt overwhelming no longer appear quite as powerful. Because perspective changes people. And I think perspective has been changing this person for a while now. Okay, the Ace of Pentacles appears, and there is something very significant about its presence here. Not because it guarantees anything, not because it promises a specific outcome, but because it feels like awareness. Awareness that every opportunity begins as a choice to remain silent, or a choice to speak, a choice to stay where you are, or a choice to move, a choice to continue wondering, or a choice to find out. And I keep sensing somebody realizing that eventually a decision has to be made. Because standing still is still a decision. Avoiding something is still a decision. Waiting forever is still a decision. And the more this person reflects on that truth, the more difficult it becomes to remain frozen. I'm noticing something here. There is still uncertainty. There are still emotions being processed. There are still questions that have not been answered. But beneath all of that, there is a growing awareness that certain connections leave a lasting mark on our lives. And once we recognize that mark, pretending it doesn't exist becomes almost impossible. The cards feel very thoughtful here, very reflective, very honest. Almost like somebody standing quietly with their thoughts, looking toward the horizon, realizing that whatever comes next begins with a choice they're willing to make for themselves. And that's where I'm going to leave this reading, Leo. I have to be honest, this felt less like a story about someone's return and more like a story about awareness, about realizing the value of something that was always there, about understanding what silence can reveal when words are no longer filling the space. Whatever part of this reading resonated with you, take only what feels right for your situation and leave the rest. Every connection unfolds in its own way, and every person moves through their lessons at their own pace. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for allowing me to read this energy with you. I truly appreciate every single one of you. Take care of yourself. Keep choosing your peace. Keep choosing your growth. And most importantly, keep choosing yourself. I'll see you in the next reading. Bye, Leo.